I'm Clay Daniel, Director of LSAT Prep for Claiborne Education. I want to talk particularly about the logical reasoning section. In the days of the LSAT Flex, it's one of 3 sections. In the past and in the future, in the future, it will probably go back to being half of the test. Either way, a very important section. And there's a number of ways to come at it and different ways to kind of talk about what is the central challenge of the LR section. Those several ways are actually worth kind of considering and layering upon one another. There's not necessarily just one right way to approach it, but often it's a matter of what clicks for you as a student. What is kind of the uniting theme in your mind that helps you approach the logical reasoning section? I want to suggest to you that one way to approach the section is to think about it fundamentally in terms of flaws, fallacies, problems with an argument, to start there and then to use that kind of thinking as something that you can apply to other kinds of questions. The advantage of doing that is it kind of demystifies the LSAT, the vagueness or the complications of it. There's a finite number of fallacies that apply on the LSAT. Different people categorize those fallacies or flaws different ways and label them different ways. Our particular list at Claiborne is 22. We've found basically 22 kinds of flaw questions or fallacies that occur on flaw questions and other questions as well. The purpose of this video is not to go through all of those, but to say, if you can learn to really label and categorize and recognize those fallacies, it can transform how easily or how quickly as well you recognize what's necessary for the question. There are many major kinds of fallacies. Some you've heard of, some you probably haven't. One students have typically heard of is correlation versus causation. You might have learned about that in statistics. It's a major fallacy on the LSAT, and it can help you see how predictable the LSAT actually is, even if it might not appear that way. That is to say, when we have a causation problem, the stimulus, that is the argument, almost always has the correlation in the evidence or premises. It'll use the word likely often. Those who have this particular medical condition are more likely to have this protein in their blood or something like that. That will be in the evidence. In the conclusion will be the causation problem. There'll be this false equivalence from a correlation to actually saying that A causes B when something else altogether might be going on. When you really recognize that and kind of capture it in your mind, you start to see it popping up repeatedly. There are less common types of flaws and some that might feel pretty obscure. Take, for example, the idea of relative versus absolute. That language is probably a lot less familiar to you than correlation versus causation. Relative versus absolute is the difference between comparing 2 elements and speaking absolutely about one. In other words, to say this dish is healthy is an absolute statement. We're not comparing it to any other dish. We're simply characterizing it. This dish is healthy. But to say this dish is healthier than that one over there is a relative statement. You know, when you start to recognize that difference and that the flaws or fallacies on the LSAT arguments often come from confusing those 2 things, treating absolute characterizations as if they were relative ones or vice versa, even though that's kind of a minor flaw type, you'll start to see it pop up more and more. Now, the last thing I want to say about this approach is it's only powerful if you recognize that this is not just for flaw questions. I mean, flaw questions are maybe 15% of the logical reasoning section. They're big, they're important. But this applies to other close neighbors of flaw questions, strengthen and weaken questions, necessary assumption, sufficient assumption, supporting principle, parallel flaw. There are a lot of different kinds of questions where this approach is going to help you. But you can even broaden beyond that and say, well, what about something like an inference question where it says, most strongly supported? Which of the following is most strongly supported by the statements above? That's not an argument question at all. You might wonder, well, how can a flaw idea apply? Well, let's think about what a good inference is. A good inference, the right answer to a most strongly supported question, should avoid making any of those 22 flaws, those fallacies, those problems. If it has one of those issues, it's probably not the answer. So notice how understanding those fallacies actually can transform your approach to really most of the questions on the logical reasoning section. It might sound like a high number, but if you think of what you've had to memorize for classes, the amount of material you've had to put in your mind, memorizing those categories and then learning to apply them as you practice is not an overwhelming task and can make you so much more both efficient and accurate on the LSAT. Talking about these kinds of strategic, powerful approaches is what we do all the time in our LSAT sessions. I'd love to talk to you more about it.